Okay, some of you may know that I work in a laboratory. Interestingly enough, the laboratory that I work in actually works with these devices called signal generators, which were the precursor to synthesizers, the technological precursor, that is, to synthesizers. And that meant that in the process of working where I currently work, I learned a little bit more about synths and stuff. I recently went out and got this one for my own musical purposes. I thought I could go through a little bit about how you build patches, using as an example a patch that came with this synth preloaded, which I really like, and it sounds like this. It's a string synth with a lowered fourth. It's a great example of how you can go from a very simple sound to a very lush, almost sort of like polyphonous sound, using all of the different oscillators and stuff that exist on a synth. So let's go through it. How would I build this patch from scratch? I can change all of the settings, and I can start with the initial signal and go through and show you what each individual parameter does. And we'll go from the basic signal to hopefully something that's pretty dang close to this. So first I need to find a patch that I don't care about to clear. So sounds good to me. I don't think I'm ever going to use that for anything. In order to clear a patch, I have to press Shift 3 and then 3 again. That's just a little tidbit for you if you happen to own a Microkorg. So on the Microkorg, we start with the voice settings. There's a few different types of voices you can create with a Microkorg. Firstly, you can do a synth or a vocoder, and in this case, we're making a synth patch. So we're going to leave that set to synth, and then we've got single versus layer. Single means that we only have one voice playing at a time, and layer you can set up to 2 voices playing at a time. This keyboard can only have up to 4 voices playing at a time in maximum polyphony. So we're going to leave it set to signal because layers, like, you can only get 2 notes. You can only play 2 notes at a time. If you try to play a third note, it takes away one of the notes. So we're gonna leave that set to signal. And then we're gonna move on and make sure that we have polyphony selected as opposed to unison, where you get a chord from one note, or monophonic, where you can only play 1 note at a time. If you try and play 2, it selects one of the notes. So we're gonna leave that on polyphony. So next we need to select a pitch. We're not gonna do anything in here, but if I wanted to transpose from the standard pitch that this comes with, I could do that in this menu. We're going to leave that alone, and we don't need to tune it at all, but we could also detune. Moving on to our first oscillator. So synths are made of oscillators. An oscillator is just an electronic device that produces a sound wave, and sound waves are characterized by their frequency, which is basically the amount of time that it takes for the entire wave from the beginning of the wave to the peak to the valley back to the beginning again for that to pass. That is the frequency from point A to point B. And you can have different shaped waves as well. You can have a sine wave, you can have a triangle wave, you can have a square wave, you can have a saw wave. And you can see in our menu here that those are 4 of our options. There's some other options here too. We're just going to not talk about that stuff because it's more specific to this synth. So yeah, these are the 4 big ones here. Most synths can produce these 4 kinds of waves. I'll kind of give you an example of what they sound like, starting with the saw wave. That's what we've been working with thus far. I can move over to square. And then triangle. And then sine. So we're kind of going from like most aggressive sounding to like least aggressive sounding, which makes sense because this is probably the least rounded wave and this one's probably the most rounded wave. So we're going to select in this case square waves because we want to do this thing called pulse width modulation. We're going to set our initial pulse width to 0, but you can vary the width of the pulses in a square wave by a certain quantity, and in doing so introduce kind of a waver to the sound, which is going to be something that we really want because we're trying to get that synth string sound, which has a lot of waver in it, a lot of sort of like shifting in different parameters as the note is played to generate something that sounds sort of like someone bowing an instrument live. So if I turn this off, you don't hear any of that waver. And then back up to 106. Cool. Oscillator 2. So Oscillator 2 only has 3 options for waves. We're going to select triangle in this case. And we're not going to be able to hear it currently because I have to turn it up in my mixer. So we're going to actually jump ahead for a second to mixer. So I want to turn my first oscillator down to 80, just 80. And then I can't hear any of my second oscillator right now, so we're going to turn that up to 100. And now we should be able to hear both. So if I turn this down again and then back up, you can hear the second triangle wave coming in. It's kind of like a more rounder oscillation in the background. We need to go back to oscillator 2 now, and then we need to introduce some other parameters here. We don't need any modulation. We could introduce some things like ring modulation here. We're going to turn that off. And then we're going to detune this by 7 semitones so that we get a nice lowered fourth sound, as opposed to, which has given us some of that additional complexity. So now we kind of have two voicings sounding from each separate oscillator. They're playing distinct notes. We can also introduce like more fine-grained detuning, but we're not going to do that. It sounds pretty crazy. Okay, so we covered mixer. Let's go to filter. We're going to set up a low-pass filter. We want it on 12, which means that we're passing lower signal and taking out higher signal as we increase the amount of filter. And then we're going to turn the cutoff down a little bit. So currently it sounds like this. If I turn down the cutoff, it gets more choked, and you can hear just the low part. So we're going to set that to 73. So we cut off some of our high end. And then we're going to turn up the resonance a little bit. I'll give you a sound of what it sounds like. When you turn the resonance all the way up, it just becomes this like reedy, quiet thing. But yeah, we're going to add in some resonance to give it some of that squeakiness, but not too much. So we can adjust the gate here as well, which you can introduce a sweep, an oscillating sweep in this if you want to, but we're just going to leave this set to 0 because we don't want any sort of sweep like that for now, at least from this source. So last thing we're going to do is adjust the filter key track here. If we turn it up like we're doing, we're going to add more filtering to the low range, and then the high range is untouched, and vice versa. And so we're going to set that to 17. And move on to filter envelope. So the filter envelope is a sweeping envelope that can cause changes to the amount of filtering that's happening as the note plays. So now let's move on to amp. Our amp we want turned all the way up. This is just basically volume, amplitude, right? And this is also where we control panning, which you can move it to one side versus the other. And we're going to go ahead and leave it in the center. And we don't need any distortion, so we're going to turn distortion off still. Keyboard tracking, do we want it to be louder at one end versus the other? No, we don't. But we could do that if we wanted to, so we're gonna leave that alone. And that's it for this menu, so we're done with amplifier. Let's move on to the envelope gate. The envelope gate is going to create sort of a swell in or like crescendo in sound as we play notes. So we're going to turn this down so that the swell in is slower. 91. And we're going to want some decay. Let's set this to 29. If you increase the decay, it takes longer to fade. Sustain, we're going to leave all the way up. And then we're going to introduce some release so that when we take our fingers off the keys, it still continues and fades slowly for just a second. We're going to set that to 84. There we go. Awesome. Cool. So we're done with our envelope gate. There's nothing else in this. Oh, it actually is tempo sync here, I think, at the end or something along those lines, but we're not going to make use of that. So we're going to, it's the envelope gate reset, but we're going to leave that alone, which basically just means that when you play a new note, the envelope gate starts over again. We don't care about that. We can leave that off. So now we're on to our second set of oscillators, which are our low frequency oscillators. Unlike oscillator 1 and 2, these don't produce their own sounds, but they produce oscillations that affect the oscillations that you can hear. So they basically just make things sound a little bit more complicated. So we're going to set our first oscillator to triangle, and we want this on voice. And then I'm going to be totally honest with you, I don't actually really know what it does. The tempo sync is going to be off still because we're not doing any kind of arpeggiation. The frequency we want this oscillator to operate at is going to be 34. So I'll turn it off to give you an idea what the difference is. So this is making some lushness come into play, right? You can see how this oscillator is playing with the other two. Okay, let's move on to our next oscillator. This one we're going to set to sine. And then we're also going to set this to voice. Again, I don't really know what this does, but that's where it should be. Tempo sync doesn't matter. And then we're going to have our frequency this time be 69. Nice. And again, this is what it sounds like with and without. We're getting into more subtle granular differences at this point. I'm not sure how crazy evident the difference is, but you know, every little bit helps. So that means that we're done with our first bank of menus. We can move on to our second bank, which is below here. And we're going to go through our patches, which basically allows us to take parameters from our first bank and kind of send them through each other to introduce additional complexity, introduce oscillations that affect oscillations and so on, or parameters that shift as oscillations occur. So the first thing we're going to do is send our LFO2 into our oscillator 2 detune option so that as the LFO oscillates, it creates variations in detuning. I gotta find 2 tune. There it is. And we're gonna set this to a pretty slow modulation depth of 3, so it's a pretty slight effect. But I can turn it up to give you an idea of what it's doing, right? We don't want that much though. We want just a little bit of wobble. Even that would be too much right here. Perfect. Okay. Second patch, we're going to send LFO1 through LFO2. So they oscillate off of each other, a little bit of additional complexity. And we're going to set this to about 20 depth-wise. I turn it all the way up. You can sort of hear it going like wow, 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 a little bit more. It's a pretty slight difference. Cool. And then we need to send our amp envelope gate through our amp. So that's going to be AEG through amp. And this is going to get set to 28. Again, we're getting into pretty subtle granular differences in our patch sound. But just to give you an idea of what's happening. And then lastly, we're going to send our modulation wheel, or sorry, we're going to send our detuning through our modulation wheel, our detuning on oscillator 2 specifically. So that's our mod wheel, and then we've got 2 tune, which is here. So when we increase modulation, you can hear the lower oscillator going up and down in pitch, but the upper oscillator stays the same pitch. So that's what we just did. You can take it away. And when you change the wheel, all you can hear is a little bit of modulation being introduced. There's no more pitch shifting. So we're adding that in right now when we do this. Awesome, so we're done with our patch bay. Now I just need to do my last 3 effects, and that's the whole shebang. Our first effect is ensemble chorus. So I'm going to select ensemble, and then the amount we want this is actually LFO speed, so it's how fast the LFO that's associated with this is going to be oscillating. And you won't hear anything until I increase the depth, but I'll give you an idea of what that sounds like. Let's go all the way first. Nice, beautiful stereo chorus. Back it up to about 82. So it's a little bit more subtle. I can also change this. It gets real farty. So go back to 43. There we go. Okay, and we're going to introduce some delay as well. We want the left to right delay as opposed to stereo and these other 2 options. This is going to be off. I'm actually not even sure what that is, but delay time, we're setting it to 68. And then it's going to be a depth of 90. So just adding in some delay for additional effect. And you can kind of hear that bouncing in the background. It's ping-ponging left to right, as opposed to the stereo, which kind of bounces more in the center. I don't know what this does. Might be a tempo sync. On to EQ. It's our last menu to go through. We have 2 bands to adjust here. I'm going to set the first one to 120. So I'm selecting that frequency and I'm going to bump that frequency slightly. This is our low frequency. It's going to make things a little bit bassier, but we're actually going to bump a high range frequency a little bit more, 7,000, and we're going to set that up to 11. And that should be pretty much it. The one thing that we also need to do that's critical before we do anything else is adjust our cutoff, because it's a little high currently. Ooh, I think that's about it. So I'll play everything back to back. Let's see. Can we get close at all? Ooh, it's pretty close. In fact, this is a little bit more open than I remember it. But if we adjust the cutoff, we can see that it's getting into the same territory. So I think we kind of hit the sweet spot there. I'm pretty dang satisfied with that. And yeah, for reference, I mean, this is what we started with. So we come a long way. Hopefully this was instructive. Maybe it'll get you interested in like playing around with digital music. It's a really open space and it's a lot of fun to play with.